Consent. It seems to be the holy grail ever since Me Too. Women should state loud and clear what they want, because when they do, that would solve all problems in the world, right? But can women in today's culture really know and say what they want? Welcome to the Balie, and also welcome to the people who are watching from home through our live stream. I'm Sophie, I'm your moderator for tonight, and we will talk about consent and all the problems and difficulties that come with it. And we will do it with the British academic and writer Katherine Angel. We are so happy that you're here with us tonight. She teaches creative and critical writing at the University of London. She wrote Daddy Issues, Love and Hate in the Time of the Patriarchy, and Unmastered, a book on desire, most difficult to tell. But the book for which we are gathered tonight here is Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, Women and Desire in the Age of Consent. And it's translated into Dutch to Morgen wordt seks beter. And it's out tonight. It's also on sale afterwards, so please don't forget to get your copy. And as I said, tonight we will discuss with her and also with our other speakers what is consent, what can we do, what situation are we in this moment, in this day and age. But we would also like to hear from you, our audience. So we have several moments in which you can also ask questions, comments, and share with us your experiences. So I'm also very much looking forward to that. We will start the program tonight, and we will do that with Lotte Houwing ten Kate, who is sitting right here next to me. She's an historian and a writer. She just completed her PhD at Columbia University in New York, and her dissertation examines the 1970s feminist thought and praxis and transformation of violence against women from a private matter to a state concern. Is that correct? Okay, great. She also contributes frequently to NRC, which I always read. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. In the Dutch press, Me Too has been described as a moral earthquake, an aardverschuiving. It is true that behavior that was perhaps ambiguous a few years ago now no longer seems allowed. But the shift in social rules is by no means new. It is in fact a new chapter in a much broader socio-political revolution that was set in motion by the second wave of feminism. While scientists were still uncovering the mechanisms of trauma, feminists were already running the first overcrowded domestic violence shelters. The first Blijf van mijn lijf huis, a shelter for women fleeing from violence, opened not far from here, nearly 75 years ago. And these shelters conducted their own research into violence and its traumatic effects, and entered into a dialogue with politicians. And their initially very radical ideas about the socio-economic functioning of power were gradually incorporated into existing organizations. And in Dutch, this was called inkapseling. In the 1970s, feminists exposed the effects of women's social subordination on heterosexual intimacy. By discussing their own experiences, they saw a structural problem instead of isolated incidents. In consciousness-raising groups, our praatgroepen, feminists invented terms like marital rape and sexual harassment. By finding linguistic terms, the women's movement enabled academics to further define and measure violence against women. This also paved the way for an ever greater politicization and criminalization of intimacy. While feminist theories about male violence against women were initially explicitly directed against the state, as well as against the nuclear family, subsidies and the feminist march through the institutions were accompanied by a gradual de-radicalization. Increasingly, activism was limited or sort of transformed into a call for legal reform. Feminist lawyers fought for the reform of criminal law, for example, for a broader definition of a concept such as coercion. And in 1991, as a response to this activism, rape in marriage was finally made into a criminal offense. Second wave feminism has turned sexual violence from a personal issue, a private experience, into a public demand for government intervention and for legal protection. We have come to find self-determination and the integrity of the body increasingly important. Sexual violence and sexually transgressive behavior, our seksueel grensoverschrijdend gedrag, are still extremely common. We can sort of read about it in the newspaper every weekend now, it seems. The category of sexual harm is expanding. For example, the secret removal of a condom during sex has very recently been criminalized here. But there are limits to what politics and law can achieve in the intimate sphere. We seem to be increasingly unsure of how to read each other and even ourselves. To express wishes and desires, we need language, but we have never learned how to find the words. And yet, self-knowledge and consent are the two requirements for what we now call good sex. But should that knowledge be necessary to protect ourselves or to stay free from violence? And how do our desires actually arise? Katherine Angel dares to pose these challenging questions, questions that we often hesitate to ask each other or even ourselves. As Angel argues, self-awareness now serves as a protective shield, a panzer, for contemporary individuals navigating sexuality. If a woman lacks a deep understanding of her desires and fails to communicate them clearly, society often perceives her as contributing to her own subjugation. The communicating of personal boundaries is becoming a kind of prerequisite for ensuring one's own safety. And with its strong emphasis on consent as the ultimate solution, the Me Too movement once again shifts the responsibility for preventing sexual violence onto the individual, usually the woman. Avoiding sexual assault becomes an individual's duty. And this stands in sharp contrast to this major change brought about by 1970s feminism, the recognition of sexual violence as a structural problem, transcending individual responsibility as well as private experience. Me Too has focused on male perpetrators and whether or not a woman consents, not on how fantastic sex, mind-blowing sex even, could come about. Angel doesn't want to justify how often sex is currently, and perhaps especially for women, bad, painful, or boring. Under the rubric of Me Too, boundaries of safe, acceptable, appropriate sex are being drawn. The starting point is thus that sex should be safe, acceptable, and appropriate. And to this is often added that it would be self-evidently women who should be protected from the unacceptable, aggressive tendencies of men. Such a view, of course, ignores the sexual autonomy and potential aggression of women, as well as the vulnerability of men. But it also ignores that sex is almost by definition not entirely safe and acceptable. That might be partly the point. Our desires compromise contemporary ideals and fantasies such as sovereignty, self-awareness, and complete control. Nowhere is the gap between what we say and what we do, or between what we think we should believe and what we truly desire, so wide. Angel convincingly shows that complete autonomy and self-knowledge are unattainable and even undesirable. This is because we only discover who we are and what we want in our relationships with others. Sex then becomes a space for the emergence of self-knowledge. The promise of the sexual revolution was sex as an act of self-actualization. In the ability not to know, to experiment, lies great power. Such intimacy does not presuppose self-knowledge, it creates it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lotte. I think you touched upon many topics that we will discuss further tonight. But maybe to start the conversation with you, Katherine, why did you want to write this book and why now?
I'd been thinking about a lot of the issues in this book for a very long time, and I'd been writing about some of them in different forms. But when Me Too happened, I felt that really important conversations were being had, yet again, because these conversations are not new, they have to keep happening, in which consent was being re-emphasized as important, and in which, the details of all the egregious ways in which women are treated in the public and the private realm were being kind of, underscored to us yet again in kind of horrible detail. But I felt that it was really important that in that kind of really unsteady time, it was unfolding extremely fast, it was very unpredictable, it was kind of flammable material. There was, I felt, a temptation to just reach for the nearest available tools and assume that they are the right tools.
To fix it quickly.
Yes, and that there's something kind of self-evident about the appropriateness of those tools. And so in the book, part of what I talk about is some of the kind of sexological research and how we think about, the nature of sexuality in men and women and so on. But another one of those tools was, of course, consent. And, in the book I make clear, and I try to make very clear every time I speak about this, that consent is the bare minimum. You should only ever have sex with somebody you know wants to have sex with you, and that should be uncontroversial. But my worry was that the mode of address that was being made to women, particularly in the wake of Me Too, was a very familiar mode in which women are exhorted to embody a certain kind of subjecthood. In this case, a confident, self-knowing subjecthood where you know what you want and you say what you want very clearly to a potential sexual partner, that mode of address, first of all, can really backfire because we know that saying no to men can be very fraught, but saying yes as a woman, expressing your desire as a woman, can really come back to bite you, not least in a court of law. But also just in the kind of, the social sphere. So it seemed to me that a lot of the things I was reading and hearing that were kind of urging me to, be clear and to really know myself and be clear so that I am safe from sexual violence seemed a really worrying reiteration of that mode of address. And I think it's really important that when we think politically and ethically about sex, we start from reality rather than from a kind of wishful ideal of sexual personhood that only ever is going to end up, backfiring on us.
On women.
Yeah.
I hear you say a lot of things together. So I hear you saying there's Me Too, which is a really big problem that really brings women into danger. And the first response is actually to lie the responsibility with women to solve it. So to be confident in saying yes or no. And yes or no can both be dangerous. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the danger of yes and the danger of no?
Well, there was one of the victims of Harvey Weinstein's crazy campaign of sexual intimidation who put it really beautifully in an interview when she said that with Weinstein, she was afraid to poke the bear. And she talked about how she had to kind of cajole him and sort of, he would be trying to get her to give a massage or have sex or whatever it was that given day. And she would have to kind of duck around him. But she couldn't say no, because that would inflame his anger so much that he would be more likely to assault her. So that's, just one example of how saying no is tricky because, some men, when they are rejected, that is the moment when you, as the person doing the rejecting, is at most risk of violence. However, I think that a lot of, very important and very well-meaning attempts to resolve the question of sexual violence have understandably tried to emphasize that, as women, we have sexual drives too. We have a rich, complex sexual life. We want things. Therefore, isn't the solution to voice that desire? Yeah. Yes, that makes a certain kind of sense, but only if you're forgetting the inconvenient fact that women are routinely punished for voicing their sexual desire, either in the form of contempt from certain men or contempt from, the wider culture. I think there is still, despite what we like to think about ourselves in terms of, how things have progressed, there is still, I think, a very visceral fear of women's sexual desire, and that can make itself felt in many ways. But it's very paradoxical, to put it mildly, I think, when on the one hand, as women, you're being urged to be very clear about your sexual desires in order to protect yourself, as a form of risk management, essentially, while also being very aware that in a court of law, evidence of your sexual desire will be used to exonerate a man. So that puts women and any victim of sexual violence in an incredibly difficult bind. If the thing that we're supposed to do in order to prevent the misunderstandings that plague especially heterosexual sex is say the kind of thing that will then be used to show that we really wanted to be sexually assaulted.
Yeah.
The question of what no means and what yes means and the power of those terms becomes incredibly murky. And that's where, in terms of the kind of history of feminist engagement with this, I think every development in the course of feminist history of, valiant attempts to deal with this problem are engagements that I admire and I'm extremely sort of grateful for. But this kind of bind that we're all in, I think, exemplifies the fact that some of those, some of the slogans we like to use, yes means yes, no means no, or, you have to just find out what you want and then be very clear,
Yeah.
They can only go so far, and they do display, I think, a kind of wishfulness that is not feminism's fault. It's the fault of the world that feminism is trying to correct. But it does leave us, I think, with a really heavy burden that can be actually very difficult to negotiate sort of minute by minute in the sexual sphere.
In the reality of the
Yeah.
bedroom. Yeah. So we've mentioned a couple of times already that we are having this conversation not for the first time. We're talking about it maybe since the 70s, maybe even before that. Can we go a little bit back in history to see the legal things that we already accomplished maybe?
Yeah, I was thinking it might be useful to say something about, there was like a big legal case here in 1987 that might be a really interesting example, in which actually a woman accused a man of rape, and he was acquitted ultimately. So the legal case, in a way, it didn't really go anywhere. But what was very interesting is that they had been partners for years. And this then became a really big question sort of for the judges, which was around, right, well, isn't consent implied?
You mean like they were love partners?
Yes.
Yeah, so...
For years, yeah. So then at what point, right, if she has said yes so many times, why a few years in, why there was one...
One sudden no.
Exactly, why there was this no. And so what was really interesting, there was a big sort of controversy in like legal journals, and of course feminist jurists, they were very angry about this case. And what was so interesting, of course, is that they then really argued for a new understanding of like force and coercion, for not having to be physical, right? Because this has been this sort of unending problem in these court cases, is that if we would not be sort of using the yes means yes, right, then how do we actually prove that it would have been against the person's will?
Yeah.
And so after this legal case, this is when feminist jurists here, when they said, well, now we should really push and kind of actually borrow from feminist philosophy, and this is where kind of American theory is then being borrowed. So this is where the Catherine McKinnon kind of comes in, and where they say, well, actually coercion could, right? It doesn't have to be physical at all. There could be economic dimensions to it, emotional. So all of these kind of different things where sort of various parts of how people interact, that should actually be
Also
considered. Yes.
Yeah, so that was a big breakthrough.
Yes, and then that sort of was a really necessary step that then led in 1991 to the kind of big like triple modification of rape law that we had here, when marital rape was criminalized, when consent became a really big part of it, but also when rape was gender neutralized, right? This is another thing that we haven't mentioned yet. But these feminists also really pushed for, in a way, there not being a male and a female body necessary in order for a rape to happen.
Yeah. Okay, that's very good. So you would say that in a legal aspect, maybe the concept of consent is good or important to have to some extent. But maybe the question is, how far can this concept from state to the personal, the private matters go? So that's maybe where the difficulty lies.
Yeah, I mean, I think like in legal terms, it's just absolutely necessary because it's, I mean, in order to have rape cases ever succeed, which they actually don't often, right? So it's like not as if this is in any way a kind of ideal situation that we're in now, but it seems that legally it's necessary. But then the issue, which of course you write about, is whether we don't sort of put our hopes, right, up way too much by, I think what's so interesting is that consent, it kind of presumes that there could be a sort of ideal state in which two people are completely equal, which we know that our society is not equal by any means. So it's a very sort of weirdly optimistic notion that if you would have two people together in the bedroom, that suddenly this complete equality is there, and that these other factors like age or social status or who is in love with the other person, for whom does this actually matter much more emotionally, right? There are sort of all of these layers to it that of course make saying yes or no and maybe also hearing yes or no much more complicated as you write. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, you're absolutely right that, you know, it's vital that we get the law right on consent, that, you know, the law is such that when cases are brought to law, it goes more fairly, you know. But for me, the worry is that we have kind of psychologically invested in the law as the place that's going to resolve questions of sex. And I think that is such a profound mistake. I think it's dangerous. I think it allows us to kind of subcontract questions that are profoundly relational. They're about what happens when two people are together in a room with their desire, their longing, their fear, their anxiety, their history, everything that's gone before in their family, traumatic experiences they may have had, unconscious memories. You know, I think we bring everything to sex. We don't know it a lot of the time. We don't know it consciously, but it's there. And I think that consent is vital, and we have to use it usefully, and we have to teach it usefully, and we have to get the law right. But really, it can be a kind of displacement activity, I think. And you can see it in quite sinister ways where it happens, where, you know, you get things like people in Silicon Valley developing consent apps where, you know, before you have sex, you like input that you've consented. I mean, how is that going to go? We know how that's going to go. That is a form of insurance for somebody who may perpetrate an act of violence and say, but look, the app said go, you know? It's so disturbing because it shows how, I mean, you know, I don't know how well those things have taken off, but as an example of a kind of way in which consent can get used as a form, you know, for women or for those, you know, for whoever is deemed the kind of vulnerable party, it's very tempting for us to think about it as a way to protect ourselves. And of course we want to protect ourselves. We live in a world that is full of sexual violence, and many people have experienced it. So, you know, I'm never going to denigrate anybody's attempts to keep themselves safe or keep someone else that they love safe. But there's that temptation, which, you know, as we've said, can really backfire. But there's also the really alluring temptation that it absolves us from thinking about the difficulty, the complexity of what happens in an encounter between people. And that's where the ethical work needs to be done. We can't actually delegate that to consent, to the law, to the state. We can't delegate it to biology. We can't delegate it to hormones. We can't delegate it to theories of sexuality. Ultimately, the buck has to stay with us as individuals in a community that hopefully wants to enable pleasurable, exciting sex that also feels like it is sustained with autonomy and dignity. And I think that most of the apparatuses that we very wishfully reach for just can't do it for us. And we've got to do the work that is actually much harder.
I think, Lotte, in your introduction, you said, you quoted actually Katherine, and you said, complete autonomy and self-knowledge are unattainable and undesirable. Is that an important thing about the book to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this plays into that it's a sort of, it's almost a kind of dreamlike idea that, right, that, I mean, that sort of, there can be this very individualistic, like, take on sex, which is just, to me, I mean, it's not dreamlike in the sense that it's just not something that I would be interested in. And it's, I think that the sort of relational aspect, which I guess also very psychoanalytically informed, considering that's something you're also really interested in, I imagine. It would be interesting if you maybe say something about that. That I think, and there's also Maggie Nelson in On Freedom also, right, writes about sort of sex then as this space in which knowledge can actually come into being. And I find this really sort of intellectual approach to sex really fascinating. And I think that that maybe speaks to that happening in these relationships.
Can you elaborate maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, we do like to take refuge in an idea of figuring things out about ourselves and then kind of bringing that knowledge into the world as a kind of, what's the word? Like, I've forgotten the word.
Like a shield or
a shield, like something to protect us with, but also in a way like an arm, you know, like we're going into battle. I'm going into this really risky terrain, so I'd better know what I want so that I can try to get what I want and to keep myself safe. And, you know, the uncomfortable fact is that, yeah, maybe that does work. You know, we probably all do a lot of that a lot of the time because we sort of feel we have to. But it can also really work against pleasure, because pleasure, and in fact not just pleasure, but I suppose the kind of maybe the deeper aspects of sex. And I do think, you know, sex is really not just about sex, and it's not just about pleasure. It's about loss. It's about a kind of state of suspension where you get to not be yourself. That's what's great about sex, is that you don't have to be this kind of put together, rational, self-knowing subject. I mean, life would be awful if we always had to be like that, which is perhaps why sex is so compelling to us. And I think that is true for men and women, but I think that gets talked about very differently. And I think that, you know, Maggie writes beautifully about this kind of stuff, and I think a lot of queer theorists have been so kind of incredible on this kind of material. And I quote Leo Bassani in this book and his very famous essay from 1987, I think it is, where he talks about sex as a kind of shattering of that experience of self-possession and power. And, you know, he talks about the kind of ethical value in the experience of a kind of boundary shattering in sex. And it's not gendered, you know, that it's not particular to any kind of sexuality or any kind of body. And I do think that there's so much mileage in kind of pressing in on that and thinking about how for everyone in sex, and for heterosexual men too, you know, we don't often think about it that way, but I think for heterosexual men too, sex involves vulnerability, it involves an experience of letting go of something, it involves, you know, a kind of abandon of mastery. And that might be precisely why It's very frightening. The stakes feel very high. It feels terrifying when you kind of really confront the possibility of loss and castration, metaphorically, through, you know, not getting the breast you want. Because, you know, traditional norms of masculinity are very invested in denying the vulnerability that men also carry with them through the world. And, you know, Jacqueline Rose has written beautifully about lots of these kinds of things. And I always think about something she's written about, how rape as a weapon of war happens precisely at the moment when men are in intense contact with the possibility of their own death. Mm. And I think that, you know, the relationship between the things that we long for and that come to feel incredibly important to us, and that if we don't get them, we're going to fucking die or we're going to injure someone else, those are the moments that are the most sort of ethically fraught. They're also the space of the most kind of beautiful possibility, and they're the places of most potential danger. And I think, you know, I mean, it's hard to get everyone talking about this kind of thing, you know, sex and death, but I do think that has to be part of the conversation when we think about violence and when we think about, you know, the problems in heterosexuality and toxic masculinity and these kinds of phrases. Like, we're not just talking about entitlement to women's bodies through socialization. That's part of it, of course. But we are also talking about a deeper existential terror that I think all of us feel. I think you all feel it somewhere, sometimes. And I think it can be helpful.
I think there's a lot needed for both men and women to make themselves vulnerable at that stage that you say. And I think there are so many blockages in society that prevent us from, I mean, for women it's always no is no, and don't get pregnant, and don't get any STDs, and don't have any sex that you don't want to, and don't.
Yeah.
And for men it's probably you always have to perform, and there's a certain way that you have to behave. Are there any things that we can do to maybe lift those blockages a little bit?
It's the $1 million question.
Asking for some solutions now.
Yeah, this always happens to me. I mean, I think, you know, the solutions have to operate on so many different levels, you know, and some of it is through language and culture and the making of cultural products that shift the dial, that expand the lens. And I do think we are in a really exciting moment for that. You know, I think that there is so much more discussion of these things, so much more questioning of, I mean, there always has been within feminism, but I feel like it's accelerating now and it's taking a different form, you know, where these kind of very stark binaries of gender and sexuality are being really profoundly questioned. And I think that is all for the good. And, you know, just in terms of what gets represented to us culturally, I mean, when I was growing up, I mean, I don't even want to think about it. It was so bad. and you know, I do think a lot can be accomplished through that kind of cultural representation. And, you know, the giving of platforms to people with a really different range of experiences that, you know, then the kind of pool of available subjecthoods for people just gets deeper and wider, and that's amazing. But I do think there are really material questions that just have to constantly be worked at. And, you know, we're living in a time of such frightening regression in terms of the backlash on bodily autonomy, you know, whether that's the right to abortion or, you know, various forms of healthcare or, you know, kind of trans healthcare, all these kinds of things. There's such an assault on the idea that people have a right to kind of determine their own relationship to their bodies and their sexualities. And I think that, you know, I mean, you were touching on this earlier, like, I think sexual violence and sexual intimidation and bad sex, you know, all these different kinds of gradations on that lovely rainbow of horror, they thrive, all those things thrive on inequality, they thrive on, you know, insecure housing, punitive immigration policies, you know, a state police force that feels entitled not just to treat complainants with contempt, but to actually perpetuate a lot of violence on women, in the form of domestic violence or assaults on women who come to them. I mean, all these things about how, our states are organized, I think are all circumstances which enable the abuse of somebody who's the more vulnerable party. If you have to trade sex for housing or for food, that's an egregious situation that people are being forced into. So I think, I think everybody has to sort of contribute what's in their gift to contribute, and some people are like on the front lines doing campaigning, and some people are making films, and some people are teachers, and I just think, it has to be a collective effort, because the problem, it's got claws in everything. So
in all aspects of society. Yeah. I want to go to the audience in a little bit, but I wanted to ask you one more question maybe, because when I read your book, I also got so tired at one point, because you wrote that
Me too.
Women are responsible for starting the conversation about sex and about what they want and what's good sex. They're responsible for preventing the violence that's happening against them, and they've been sort of shouted at from all angles that they should do stuff. Is there any way to share the burden maybe with the predators as well? Maybe Lotte, you also have some ideas.
I think you should go first.
Yeah, I get asked this a lot, and I also often don't know what to say, really. I mean, I do think that something about Me Too was very exciting, actually. I had very mixed feelings about it, because it seemed to me that, it was a kind of spectacle that thrived on women's pain and humiliation. And I don't know about you, but, I found it quite stressful turning on the radio every day, and oh my God, another story.
experience.
And, this happens to us a lot now. And in one way, it's amazing, because people at least, they are talking about it. I think there is a much more, there's a mainstreamization of some of these concerns. But I'm not always sure what that leads to in terms of actual concrete change. And it's always very easy for, organizations and systems and, a capitalist system to incorporate every critique and then just churn it out in a form that changes nothing. But I have felt heartened by the fact that there have been conversations that certainly, that I've had with men, and that a lot of people I know have had much more generally with people, about the kind of minutiae of these things, that has felt like something has shifted a little bit. We are perhaps slightly less lonely in that conversation, even if it sometimes has a tinge of, yet another spectacle for us to watch on TV before we do nothing, or governments do nothing about actually changing the conditions that we're in. And, and I think a lot too about, platform capitalism and it's not on us to sort out our relationship to Instagram because it's designed to make us live in a world of screen and kind of and fear, I think. And I do feel really, really kind of concerned about what is not being addressed in terms of our relationship to ourselves and to the other. But it is the age-old question. Like, I mean, there are men here, which is great. But how do you talk to people about things that affect them very painfully too? Because I think it's quite a difficult time for men, and people often say this in a way that can feel really kind of anti-feminist, like, oh, poor men, they're having to like think about whether they're going to assault somebody or not. But I do think, I do think that, I think it's very complicated to be a man because, the pressure to be this hyper-functional sexual machine that, you know, by the way, has this incredibly vulnerable, visible mechanism whereby we can see whether men are succeeding or failing, you know, in the form of erection. I think that, you know, the kind of horrors of the lost erection or, you know, the sexual failure, I think for men can be catastrophic. And I think it's the source of a lot of violence. And I think we absolutely have to find a way to speak about sexual violence and sexual coercion and bad sex with men that doesn't humiliate them.
Yeah.
Because humiliation only ever leads to violence. You know, the worst things in the world happen because somebody felt humiliated and then they go and pile on someone else or they take out their shame. I think, you know, a lot of the time sexual assault is the attempt to get rid of one's own shame by literally discharging it into someone else's body. And so I think that, you know, I'm not answering the question, but I'm saying it's really important that we find ways to have these conversations in a way that doesn't exclude men's own, perhaps willingness, but fearful and perhaps understandable defensive willingness to talk about this stuff.
To really engage them in an honest way.
Yeah, and not to shame them for the difficulties that they're in, because I don't think it's easy.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you if you see then education as having, like, as being the means in order to achieve this?
Yeah, I definitely think it's part of the means, and I think that I mean, I feel like the Netherlands has this reputation everywhere else as being like the gold standard for sex education, and I suspect it's more complicated than that.
I think so, yeah.
Of course.
But, you know, it is a lot better than in the UK, I can tell you that for a fact. And, you know, and my feeling is that you basically have to start talking to kids very, very young about sex. And, you know, depending on their age, you're not necessarily going to be telling them, you know, the lovely, gory details at age 3 or whatever. But in a sense, you know, with sex, I mean, there's a stage when children just don't understand, and then there's a stage when they do. Mm. But the whole way through, I think we have to be talking not actually necessarily about consent, but I think we have to be talking about pleasure, because I think that one of the really disturbing things is that we don't talk to girls and to young girls about what their bodies feel like, what feels good. You know, we might talk to them about, you know, if somebody does that to you, come and tell me. You know, if something bad happens, if that doesn't feel good, you must tell me. But it's very frightening for us to talk to children, but especially to girls, about pleasure, because we feel that then we're putting them in the path of danger. But they're in the path of danger anyway. And if we're teaching or, you know, encouraging really small children to think about how they feel about their bodies, but also how to relate to the other person. You know, what do you do when you want something from that person, whether it's sex or whether it's, you know, their plasticine toy or whatever? What do you do if they don't want it? You know, how do you respond? How do you feel? And then what do you do on the basis of those feelings? You know, if you feel really upset and really angry, what does that entitle you to do or not? And I think that, you know, the earlier the better, and there has to be an emphasis on the kind of internal stuff, because I think we get hoodwinked and we get distracted by these quite abstract things that we bring in to the conversation, when often fundamentally, you know, the path to pleasure and fulfillment in life is often about thinking, what's going on in me? And then how do I communicate that to the other person? And I say that like it's simple, and it's not. But I think, you know, talking to 5-year-olds about consent is not very useful. But talking to them about how they feel probably is.
And it's a much broader conversation than just sexual.
Yeah, and it can apply to everything.
Yeah. I will ask Monique if she wants to grab the mic and see if there are any questions in the audience or comments or things that you have not heard. I see a very few enthusiastic fingers going up.
It sounds all a bit academic to me. I have the feeling I don't recognize anything when I'm thinking about my own sexuality with all the men and boyfriends I had. I don't know if this is also for the rest of this audience, but it seems as it is all dealing about other people and about men who are assaulting women, which is not my experience. So I have also the feeling, where's the responsibility of women themselves in having good sex? That's not what I hear. It's all the men who are giving us bad sex. But when women know how to masturbate, for example, and get an orgasm, you can explain it better. How many of the women that are assaulted do have orgasms by themselves? I don't know, but that's what I miss in this kind of discussions. It's about somebody else, somewhere in this bad society with male and female, but that's what I miss.
Thank you. I think it's a good comment, and we will talk to a sexologist in the second half. So maybe your question will be answered, but maybe someone wants to respond to it already.
I mean, I guess I don't quite recognize your depiction of what we've been talking about. I think we have been talking about. I guess I don't quite understand the question. It's not quite clear to me what you're asking.
Because I actually agree with it, that it feels like you're talking about men as the perpetrators and women as the victims. I've heard a lot of male versus female categorizations. Okay. And I have actually the exact same concern that for me it generalizes two categories of people, while there are also probably a lot of men who might feel assaulted, or men with men, women with women. And I'm also a bit concerned about it indeed.
I mean,
and yes, as a
I can answer that for sure. I think that all different kinds of people are the victims of sexual violence. I mean, we've said that, I think. The majority of perpetrators of sexual violence are men. Both those things can be true, I think. And I mean, you know, in my writing, I'm talking primarily about heterosexual sex, and I'm talking about the problems with heterosexual sex, right? So that's what the book is about. But, well, I don't know. I mean, you can read the book and see if you think that that's a kind of worldview where, you know, men are just the perpetrators and women are the victims. I don't think that's true at all. I mean, I think that one of the things that's actually really interesting is thinking about this idea of the victim and what we associate it with, and all the work that is done in order to kind of place the victim somewhere else. You know, so that I think the history of feminist thought around sexual violence has been really complicated, partly because, you know, nobody wants to be the victim. Nobody wants to experience themselves as the victim. Nobody wants to kind of adopt that. I mean, maybe some people do, but, you know, in general, there's a kind of anxiety around adopting that identity, if you like. And I think that has really weird and interesting effects on how the conversations around violence and bad sex and pleasure go. But yeah, I mean, I absolutely don't think that men are perpetrators and women are victims. I mean, that would be an absurd thing to think.
Hi, I'm really glad that you brought up the topics of inequality and like economical, political, and capitalism, because I think those are the reasons that in this society the violence happens mostly by men because they feel entitled and so on. And I wanted to give an example of a different society which solved it in a different way, and that is Zapatistas. They were here a few years ago, and they also took part in like our communal events, and they also said like, oh, you keep talking a lot about the rape and violence between men and women. We don't have that problem. And we were like, oh, really? Yeah, we just don't, like that doesn't happen. And partially because the men in their community do not feel entitled or like superior to women. And the other reason is that women also have guns.
That helps a lot, I think.
So this kind of like radical equality and radical empowerment, because they fight together against the oppressions of capitalist society and so on. And so they have kind of decolonized their gender relations and their sexual relations. And if the rape happens, then the whole community punishes the perpetrator, so then it just doesn't happen again.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, it's clearly not just the guns, because, you know, lots of women in the US have guns, and but I mean, yeah, it sounds very interesting. But yeah, I guess, I mean, what you're hinting towards is, you know, the question of, are there forms of sort of organization of life that can prevent sexual violence? And yeah, I mean, I would like to think so, but I guess I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What really struck a chord with me was that you said, what you talked about, the source of violence might be shame. And when I look around and I look at the more subtle interactions between men, women, people, there are very subtle forms of humiliation, castration. Could be sometimes the way somebody looks at the other one. It could be the tone of voice. And sometimes the male of the species don't really see what's happening, but they have the effect. And I have lots of interesting conversations with my daughters, because they're like, we watch these things and think like, oh, look, we see what a woman is doing. As a woman, as women, we recognize the subtlety of interaction, and men often don't realize that, but they do feel the effect. And there is a shame, there can be a very subtle shaming happening. And this is something that I miss in the conversation with lots of feminists, that, you know, that's being missed out, because somehow women seem to be holier than we are. We're not. So.
Interesting. Thanks.
Maybe one more.
What I can I hold it? Yeah. What I don't hear a lot about, actually, what I find quite underrated, is that what happens a lot. Well, it has happened a couple of times to me. Is that men groom, trick women into casual sex when you do not want casual sex. But they groom you, they love bomb you, and then after they've had you, they dump you. And then you feel extremely used. And I find it a form of rape, actually, because it's very dishonest. And I never hear anything about that. And it happens a lot, and I think it should stop. It really should stop. And, you know, talking about consent, you know, now all of a sudden, if you go on a date, you sort of have to say, well, listen, you know, I do not do a one-night stand. I do not do casual sex. But then, of course, it will say, no, of course, no, I really like you. I think you're wonderful, and all that. And then, you know, and then after one or two times, then you're dropped like a bomb. And, you know, talking about consent, I think that should be talked a lot more, because it's a real problem, the grooming. Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, the world of dating is, it's not a picnic for anyone. Yeah.
I do think you have an interesting part in your book about pickup artists and about the whole business that goes around it. And I think the men who are teaching each other to no is not really no, and you have to insist a little bit more, and how that plays into each other. Maybe that's a little bit...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's often, I mean, lots of people have argued that, you know, that there's a kind of instrumentalization of the other in the world of dating, and, you know, perhaps, I mean, I don't know whether more so in straight relationships, I don't know, but you know, I think there will always be people who relate to one another in quite a instrumental way, and sometimes that's fine to be related to instrumentally. Sometimes we want instrumental relationships. Sometimes they're exciting. Sometimes they're good. But I guess, you know, the whole history of human life is a history of difficulty around these kinds of interactions.
Yeah. It's not a safe space.
Yeah, it's not. We want something, somebody else wants something. How do those two things meet? And will we be left feeling elated or crushed by that experience? You know, obviously, you know, we want to make sex a space of pleasure and excitement, but you know, the human encounter is not an easy one. It's not. Yeah. And I think, you know, it can sometimes be useful to remember that.
Yeah. I think it's last thing that I'm going to say, but I think it's interesting at the first moment you said it gets harder and harder to talk with each other about what we like and what we don't like. And now also talking about capitalism, I suddenly think, is it because we can choose and pick everything in our life and smooth it completely over, and there's just one part that we can't really control, and that desire that we don't really know that we have maybe, or that we are unsure of, and letting go of control, that becomes scarier maybe in this time. Yeah.
Well, what's very interesting in our country, of course, is that we know that teenagers are now having sex at a later age than their parents did.
Yeah.
And they're also having sex like less frequently. So it kind of seems to be moving online, with sort of teenagers actually not really knowing how to engage. Yeah.
Lotte, thank you very much for being here. Give her a warm applause. And I would love to introduce our last guest of this evening, Elise van Alderen, sexologist, medical doctor, and author of the book Wellust, a book that guides women to sexual autonomy. Your expertise is in the treatment of sexual problems of women especially, and your mission is to free women of all the restrictions that are placed on them sexually. Welcome, Elise. Very good that you're here. You had some trouble on the way, but you're all here.
I'm here.
That's really good. So you have a practice as well, where women and you're just packing out some stuff. That's really good. Maybe it's good to address that also. What do we have here on the table?
I'll keep my deo in my bag.
Okay, we have some clitorises. I don't know the multiple.
Clitoris.
Clitoris.
Yes. The emphasis is on the first. How do you say it?
Clitoris. Clitoris.
No, it is clitoris.
I would say
the first
yes.
lettergreep. I don't know what it is in English.
Oh.
Okay.
So
clitoris.
You brought them here to show us. I'm a little bit distracted. Sorry. So you have a practice in the Netherlands for women and couples with who are experiencing some troubles sexually.
I only treat women.
Only treat women. Okay.
Yes.
And why is that?
Because I started treating couples, but during therapy I noticed they kept rolling around in the pattern that actually always arises, the pattern of guilt with the women, of feeling of failing, and the feelings of rejection with the man. So they both weren't honest, and it didn't work. So I decided
to dump the man.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it comes down to dumping the man, because I think women are in a much greater disadvantage sexually than men, and that's why I choose to treat women, and it worked.
And you said that women are often feeling like they are failing in a relationship.
Yes.
Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Well, they don't recognize themselves in the picture presented of sex. They deep down inside they feel broken or not normal, because they are not able to enjoy sex, or they don't have sexual desires. They They feel they're failing their partner, they're doubting, they think they're broken. So there are a lot of questions they have.
Yeah. And how do you try to free them from those, I mean, internalized feelings maybe that?
Well, yeah, that's a long way for some women. For some women, it's a short way, but it all comes down to I guide women in feeling free and being able and allowing themselves to enjoy their own bodies, because, in my opinion, that is what sexuality all comes around. It's about your own body, and you have the solo sex, and then you don't have anyone in the place, and in partner sex, you have 1 or 2 or 3 other persons with you, but then the focus is always enjoying your own body. It's always sharing it with somebody else. And if you are not able to do that, you give yourself away, and that can give some resistance to sex.
Yeah. And to come back to the clitoris that is before us, do you also use that in your practice?
Yes, I do. I will show it to the public. I do. You wanted to ask something about it?
Yeah. Do you use do you use that in your practice also to show to your patients?
Yes, because most of us, I think, concerning your age, have grown up with no knowledge at all about the clitoris, or only getting the information that's about some little echt groot knopje. I don't know that in English.
Like a dot somewhere.
Yeah, a little dot between the shame lips, we call them.
Yeah, we have a
it's
terrible
very
word for
terrible.
that.
It's terrible. Yes.
See, the Dutch are not that enlightened.
No, they're not. They're not. No. So, and in fact, it's a whole organ, and it's when the baby in the uterus has some same as an organ, and in the half of the people it becomes the clitoris, and half of the people becomes a penis. So it's the same organ.
Yeah. So it starts with that knowledge.
Yes, it's
about
the only
your own
organ.
body. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the only organ in the total human body with pleasure as function. The men don't have it. Women do have that organ, but they don't know that they have it, so they cannot derive pleasure from it.
Yeah. So you focus a lot also on women learning to know their own body, learning to know what they like themselves. But how does that go when they interact with others? Do they know more when they know their own bodies, or does it also maybe is complicated sometimes?
Well, another complicating fact is that women are from little girls on are like putting the attention to their bodies, to how they look, and not to what they feel. And when having sex, that results in taking the position of the spectaculating. So they're spectaculating themselves, and you cannot feel what you want, and if you're having a good time, and look at yourself at the same time.
Do you also see this problem with women?
I mean, I find it really interesting. This stuff about like how much more complex the clitoris is than has historically been even like represented in anatomy manuals and textbooks and stuff like that. And I mean, I think it's good. It's useful to kind of disseminate that knowledge. But I suppose one of the things I find quite interesting is that. So I suppose like I've always known that my clitoris isn't just a little button. I mean, I've always known that my organs of sexual pleasure are quite diffuse, and they're connected. Like I sometimes think about, sometimes people say like, oh, I'm really bad at geography. I can't place, Amsterdam on the map. It's really terrible. And I think, well, I mean, there's nothing terrible about not having a map-centered view of the world, because that's not actually how we live, right? Most of the time, I can only see what's in front of me. I don't have an aerial view. And I sometimes think about that in relation to how we think about sexual science. I think that knowledge can be useful, but there's a lot of knowledge that we can get from tuning in to our bodies, which, you know, is also what the work that you do with your clients, it seems. But I think sometimes there's a sort of fetishization of sex research where, you know, we can study all these different things and put people in labs and hook them up to plethysmographs and, you know, and measure everything that's going on in their bodies when they're watching these stimuli, which are mostly pornography or, you know, kind of sounds and stuff. And then we're kind of going to learn things about sexuality. And I find that to be, in fact, a kind of symptom of something that, you know, happened from the late 19th century through the 20th century and has only built since, which is a feeling that once we have knowledge that is visualizable and that's quantifiable, that's when we're kind of going to be able to solve things. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the knowledge that we kind of already have in ourselves in terms of, you know, what feels good. And I think that, you know, some of the problems that happen around sex is, you know, as you say, like when people, for whatever complex social reasons, are disincentivized from thinking about their own sensations, their own experiences, what feels good in that particular moment, and when it becomes difficult to talk about that with a sexual partner. So, you know, I think it's just really crucial to make sure we're using these different tools without, you know, placing an undue emphasis on something that, you know, has the ring of science, and science will save us, and it won't.
Yeah. So the danger is that it's becoming the only truth there is to our bodies. Yeah. If we only learn that these three things work, then that will work for till the end of time, I guess. Do you also see that danger?
Three things as in?
Like when you do research or when you say get to know your body in this way, and maybe you find that you like certain things, and then the danger is thinking that will work for the rest of your life in all kinds of situations.
Well, I think it's an ongoing process. Getting to know yourself is about self-discovery, self-knowledge, and self-esteem and self-expression from that. But the self-discovery is a lifelong process, because you change. Your life changes, your phase where you're in changes, so your body changes. So it's an ongoing process. You can never be done there, be arrived. It's always continuing.
And we also talked maybe in the previous conversation a little bit about that sex is maybe never really safe, because you never really know what you might want or what you might want to learn or change. Is there a way that your patients can maybe anticipate to that, or that you teach them that?
Well, I think you can get a greater safety if you are familiar with your own sexuality, if you feel free with your own arousal, your own desires, if you can feel. So a lot of people cannot feel. They're just performing an act, they're just doing sexual acts on another person. But in my opinion, sex is about feeling, and partnered sex is about sharing an experience of joy and of pleasure in equality. So I think it's I knew this word would come and I'm forgetting it. It's a verarming.
Impoverishing?
Yes. Yeah. Of sex.
Yeah.
If we see it just as a subsequence of act, because it is much larger than that, and it's like you said, you bring everything to the room, and that is, or to the bed, or wherever you are, and that is what it makes so larger than life, and that there is your freedom, but there is the anxiety as well. Freedom never goes without anxiety. It's about bearing the anxiety, and then you will be able to feel the freedom in it. That's how I see it.
Yeah. We also talked a little bit about the vulnerability of men in the previous conversation. How do you deal with that?
I don't.
I think I read an interview
But actually,
Should I?
I mean, you know, I just think everybody can be helped by these kinds of approaches.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not
That's
saying
true.
you have to. You know, you should do what you want to do. Obviously.
No, but I think that's true. This counts for every human. For me, every there is no human sapiens and then two subspecies, the man and the woman, and that we're completely different sexually, because that's a recipe for disaster. It shows already so many people are struggling sexually, and that is because we state there are two different kinds of people sexually. There are not. They're all human beings, and it's for all human beings. Sexuality, being able to enjoy sex, is being able to feel and to share and to. It's not about consent. Is a one-way street. It should be a two-way or three-way street.
What do you mean by that? It's a one-way street.
Well, it's like, I want to perform an act. That's how the bigger picture now is. I want to perform an act. Are you okay with that? And then the other person can say yes or no.
And there's no maybe.
Was that very straight? Yeah, well, that is how it's. Well, it's a very small set, but that's the bigger picture. But it's a two-way or many-way street, and it's about feeling. It's about emotional awareness. It's about body language. It's about tuning in. It's on that level where we have to go to that level, and we have to dive in ourselves in the first place to be able to share from that level.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with so much of what you're saying. I mean, I guess for me, a question about that thing that you just said then about, you know, like going into yourself and then going into partnered sex. Mm. I wonder about that because I think that, you know, sex with someone else is so different from masturbation. And precisely because there's someone else in the room. Mm-hmm. And there's someone else with their own wishes and fears and everything. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I think you see it quite often in the kind of sort of sex ed literature, you know, especially directed to young girls, you know, and it makes sense, right? Because if young girls experience very frequently, which I think is undeniably the case, pressure on them to do, you know, whatever it is, you can see why it becomes really important for educators to say to girls, listen, you have your own sexuality and you can go and explore it yourself. And, you know, I think masturbation is very valuable. But it seems to me that, you know, you can masturbate as much as you like. You can have your own relationship to your own body and your own pleasures alone, but then the game changes when there's someone else there. Mm. And I think that's inevitable, and it's always, there's always a kind of really just completely world-changing difference in that moment that means that it's not actually clear how people map their kind of sense of themselves individually onto a sexual encounter. And then, you know, added to that, of course, you've got a culture that is making women feel that they have to be a certain way or whatever. So, you know, I think it's very fraught, but I think it's important to maybe not think of it in terms of like this thing that I discover and then I take out into the world, but like what can you discover together? You know, what is possible in the encounter with another person or several other people that is going to be qualitatively really different from what you do alone. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really challenging. But it's that relational aspect that is also something we need to help people think about and experience and to try to lessen some of that, you know, that anxiety that you were talking about.
Yes.
And that is also difficult to do with people individually, you know, which is why I guess, you know, couples therapy and sex therapy is so interesting because it's trying to deal with that with more than one person in the room, which I can imagine is quite difficult.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also what we talked about in the very beginning, the danger that there's this idea that if you know yourself, you will have good sex. Mm-hmm. And it's a given. Is that also something you are afraid of, that puts too much pressure on women?
Yeah, well, the goal of my treatment is not, well, go and masturbate. I call it self-pleasure, because masturbate is, I will not go into that, but the roots of masturbate is not so nice.
Male seed.
Yeah.
Okay, self-pleasure.
Just go and self-pleasure, and then you can tell him to what knob he has to
push. Yeah.
So you can come, and then, well, okay, that's not my... That's not my goal. My goal is making women sexually secure, so that they know themselves, and that they feel complete and independent in sexuality, because they are, but they seldom feel that way because of what society tells them their whole lives. So when they feel like they're a complete person, and who can make her own choices and who is not independent of anyone for her own sexual pleasure, that will do something with her in that encounter. I totally agree, sex is complicated. It's very complicated, partnered sex. But when you feel, as a person, you feel strong and safe and free with your own sexuality, then you take that in your encounter with the other person. And that's my goal. So I tell those women, I guide you to sexual autonomy, sexual security, sexual freedom, whatever your goal is, and then you take it, and good luck. And it works. It works because the pattern is shifting. And the man, her partner, has to change as well. She opens up. She tells him, her body language changes. She knows herself, so she can tell. But it goes deeper than that. Most women that come to me, I already tell you, think they're a failure. They're broken. They're not normal. And they experience they are. So that they think they're broken, and they're managed to repair themselves. And that is what they're taking with them.
I just have to think about one sentence in your book. I just think of it now, and it says, I think in the psychiatric handbook, it talks about, for men, it talks about desire, and when it talks about women, it talks about motivation. And I think that's so telling about how we see the desire of men and women, and also what you say about the societal things that women think sex is, or that their bodies is, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of that sex research is, it's looking into how people respond, how genital arousal works, what people say about what they find arousing versus what their bodies do, etc. But fundamentally, I think a lot of that research is motivated by the attempt to answer, often in very stark terms, what's the difference between men and women, a very stark binary.
Yes.
And it is really interesting that there's research that's happened in the last kind of 20 years or so that was trying to undo certain problems within the kind of psychiatric nomenclature. And that a lot of feminist researchers have been really enthusiastic about. And some of that research is research that says that women have a more circular and responsive relationship to desire. So, the model that gets often applied to men is, they just experience spontaneous desire, then they get aroused, and then, hopefully the rest follows. Whereas for women, this research suggests, women often start from a state of neutrality. It's like a car gear. We're in neutral, we're like not feeling this terribly strong, spontaneous desire. But if the conditions are right, and a partner approaches us in the right way, and if we're not too stressed, and if maybe, he's done some washing up, it's so gendered the way this stuff gets talked about, then we will warm up, and then our desire will emerge from our arousal. So you might start to feel aroused, and then you might be like, oh, actually, do you know what? I'm really up for it, even though you were kind of neutral before.
Yeah.
And I think that research is really interesting because studies do suggest that, for instance, women in long-term relationships experience a very steep fall in their sexual desire in a way that heterosexual men in those relationships don't. So there's something that can be said, in a limited way with these kind of statistical generalizations. But the thing that's really troubling is the language that gets used about it. So it's all libido and desire for men, but women in some of this research, we supposedly have sex. We have incentives for sex, and those incentives often, you might be unsurprised to hear, are things like, wanting a guy to stick around so he can raise our kids, or, wanting intimacy and wanting these other things that then we might kind of bring sexual desire in.
It's
because
a trade-off.
we're motivated.
Yeah,
it's a trade-off. And I think it's such a dangerous way of thinking about sex, because it's a very small step from that to then arguing that in order to get things we want, we have to provide sex, which is exactly how evolutionary psychologists talk about sex. And there was one more thing I wanted to say about that, but it's kind of escaped me.
Well, it's interesting that it also places the women in a responsive role, always.
Yeah.
And it's the same, of course, with consent, because people ask women for consent, and we have to say yes or no.
Yeah.
But we never do the asking or do the...
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, it completely entrenches a dynamic where it's men who want and women have to figure out, like, oh, I'm going to calculate, the cost. I'm going to do my little cost-benefit analysis here, and I conclude that in order for these other things I want, I'm going to agree to have sex. It completely erases women's own weird, complicated relationship to their own desire that might be very strong, but that also might be compromised in lots of ways by the world in which we live. And, if we're going to use that language of incentive and motivation, don't tell me that men don't have incentives and motivations for sex. They very much do, not least the incentive that is if they don't fulfill, that ideal of masculine sexual success, they will potentially feel like failures. Yeah. So that's a pretty big incentive, but it's that the incentives that socially we place on male sexuality are ones that we've rendered invisible to ourselves.
Do you recognize these roles?
I recognize these roles, but they're all bullshit. Because
Well, of course.
Well, there are a lot of evidence that against it, but it doesn't get feet on the ground because the status quo wants to maintain the world we live in. But spontaneous desire doesn't exist, and desire works the same for every human being. You have a sexual cue, and you get arousal, and if you want to do something with arousal, you have the desire. And that's for everybody. So it's not like, oh, I'm on the couch and I want to have sex. That's it doesn't exist. But that's the picture we're given on the television, or nowadays everybody
on the internet.
And so. It colors our vision, and it's internalized like, okay, that's normal sex. Yeah. But it's not.
So we have to rethink desire, both men and female.
We have to rethink everything. I tell my clients, really, I tell my clients, forget everything you heard, you read, you listened about sex. Forget everything and find your own truth. Your own sexual truth is within you, and it's about finding it and living your life according to it. That's what it's all about. And all things society tell you just messes it up. It just takes you away from your own truth. So please forget it.
I think that's a good end. A good advice for everyone here in the room. I think we can talk a little bit more at the bar together. We will have a drink, also non-alcoholic drinks, of course. Thank you so much for being here, Elise, and also thank you a lot for being here, Katherine Angel. Thank you so much for this evening.